This will be a brief overview of teams inside of organizations. The advantages of teams is they can create a synergy where the whole is greater than the sum of its individual parts. And team membership will be able to achieve far more than could be achieved otherwise by individuals. Teams can be formal groups, officially recognized by an organization, sort of the top-down organizational chart idea of formal teams, or they can be informal, which is not necessarily recognized on any organization chart or created for any organizational purpose, but they emerge as the informal structure from a very natural or spontaneous relationships. Very often, while goals are set through formal organizations, it's often the case that informal teams are the glue that keep an organization moving and help goals be achieved. There's also committees where people are put on meeting teams and taking on tasks outside of their daily job assignments, or they could be assigned to project teams, pilot groups, or task forces where they could move onto an assignment and work on something specific for the organization. It tends to be time-bound, have a completion date, and the team would disband once the task is accomplished. And this could be if something was going to be tested inside the organization and they wanted to try it in a small way before expanding it throughout. There are also cross-functional teams where people from different functional units can get together and look at a problem, say, holistically, across all the aspects of the organization. Sometimes you can see self-managing teams where the team has more authority to complete their work. So there's many benefits to a team. Again, performance through synergy, there's more resources to solve problems, the potential for more creativity and innovation, potentially a higher level of quality in decisions, possibly more motivation and satisfaction of team members in terms of what they're there to accomplish. And then there's a potential diversity within teams, such as the variety of values and personalities and experiences and cultures and demographics that folks bring to a team. Certainly a greater variety of ideas and perspectives. And, that gives an opportunity for spontaneous discussion where, many aspects of a problem can be analyzed. However, as a team diversity increases, the interpersonal relationships do get more complex. And this is why team governance, things such as meeting agendas can be very helpful in helping a team move forward and succeed. Some common issues that happen inside teams, there can be personality conflicts, certainly different work styles. If agendas become ambiguous, that can be a problem, or if the problem is not defined clearly. There could be personal characteristics where teams can lose motivation. For example, there's the person who takes on all the work because somebody might be just along for the ride or not doing their assignments, so that person sort of gets seen as the sucker who gets all the tasks. These things can happen in an organization, in a team. And these influences on teams come from many different levels. There's business structures, such as how you deal with customers or products or your marketing position. There's organizational structures, reward systems, hierarchy, cultural norms, the written rules. These are things that can influence team dynamics. There's interpersonal structures, the unwritten rules, if you will, the roles and responsibilities within the team, the personal relationships. And then, there's individual structures, often referred to as mental models, how each individual thinks, their belief systems, and their assumptions. These mental models can really affect the team if they're not recognized. For example, here's two examples right here. So if somebody believes that meetings are a waste of time, and I attend but don't actively participate, and then the agenda items don't get completed, which leads me to again believe that meetings are a waste of time, and it creates this vicious cycle. The other example here is if management seems to be out of touch, which means I'll do whatever I want, which means management is not informed, which means they continue to be perceived as out of touch. So there's these vicious cycles which can happen based on individual team members' mental models. One more would be if subordinates are conflicted within the team or in the department. Subordinates will withhold their comments or withdraw or not challenge, and then the manager assumes they don't care, and manager gets frustrated and starts pushing his or her own views, which makes the subordinates conflicted, et cetera, et cetera. So just 3 quick examples of mental models and how they can affect team performance. There's an important concept called the ladder of influence. It's how we think, it's how we view things, how we treat information, how we effortlessly add meaning and draw conclusions that may or may not be true. Here's an example right here where somebody is doing a presentation and notices that Bill in the group hasn't said a word. So that's an example of data. Then she immediately applies meeting that says Bill is bored with my presentation, and then adds more meeting. He thinks this isn't important, and then drawing a conclusion is that Bill thinks I'm incompetent. And none of that may actually be true. It's just the ladder that we emotionally and psychologically climb as we start to try to make things make sense, when it just simply can be that Bill didn't feel like saying anything that day, or didn't feel well that day, or who knows what it was. So there's jumping this ladder, and we do it so quickly that we're highly vulnerable to error, and basically taking actions of things that are incorrect can create some really negative team dynamics. Now, within a team, you want basically mutual learning, which comes through a combination of inquiry and advocacy. You want to be able to have everybody express their opinions, and you are hoping that everybody can seek out other people's views. If you only use one or the other, so for example, if you're only an advocate, you come across as somebody who is forcing your point of view. If you're somebody who only is inquiring from others and not sharing where you're coming from, then that could lead to like an interrogation feel. So the goal here is to be able to balance that. Each team member needs to learn how to negotiate through the team and through the issues, through both of these concepts of advocacy and inquiry. Teams go through interesting evolutions. They tend to start in the forming stage where they're given a new problem, and they start through an orientation. They're not necessarily ready to perform well because they come in with low skill in terms of the specific problem at hand, and not necessarily a ton of confidence. So there's low will at that point as well. As the team starts to move forward in their meeting structures and things along those lines, what happens is they start to compare their experience with past experiences. So what happens is their will starts to get high before their skill does, because the team maybe doesn't really know what they're supposed to be doing yet. And that phase, when you move from forming to storming, is the most complicated part of teams, because it's often referred to as the dissatisfaction stage. This tends to be where the room gets very noisy and there's a lot of arguments that are occurring because the will is very high, but there's not necessarily a clear clarity around direction, and the team may not be prepared to actually meet its ultimate goal. Managing a team along this lines is difficult for a manager or a group leader. At this point, you need to sell your ideas enough so that the team is willing or able to bring their own will down and listen more actively so that their skill can increase. That would be moving to a stage called norming, or the resolution stage of team development. And once their skill goes up and they sort of feel like let's call it you don't want to say beaten down, but certainly their perspectives have been morphed and moved down a different path. But once that happens, a good leader then can facilitate and support their team and hopefully motivate them to move into the performing phase. Depending on the complexity of the project, the moving through these stages of forming, storming, norming, performing, it can take a short period of time. It can take as long as a year or more, depending on the scope. Okay. So continuing through that, there's ways that decisions should be made on teams. They go from directive to participative, and these should be used based on the situation at hand. So, for example, if there is a low amount of time required for a decision to be made, quite often the best way to go about that would be using individual dominance, where somebody just makes a decision, oftentimes the group leader. If there's a situation where there's a very complicated issue where only a couple of folks on the team have the insight or the skill or experience, they might be asked to go off and study an issue and come back to the group with a recommendation. That would be an example of minority influence. If a problem requires a high level of trust, or the problem is quite severe and it impacts a lot of folks, we would move more towards the participatory approach, which would be the unanimous view or the consensus view, which I'll get to more in a minute. The one which is one you should shy away from is the middle ground or majority rules, where a group leader just says, let's kind of vote on it. And that's not necessarily the best way. In fact, most of the times it's not the best way to go, because the outcome of that could have winners and losers, and that could lead to less team buy-in. Back to consensus, a very good tool to use is called the levels of consensus, where when a group gets stuck and they keep arguing, it's a good way to find out what they're arguing about. So, for example, if you were to pull out this document and have people state where they are, if they say they're an unqualified yes to a decision, that's a good thing. That means they're in agreement. If they find the decision perfectly acceptable, that also sounds good. If they can live with the decision, but they're not especially enthusiastic about it, that still tilts towards agreement. So that means that if that person is still arguing, it's their enthusiasm more than they're willing to move forward. Number 4 is interesting. It's I do not fully agree with the decision. I need to register my view of it. However, I do not choose to block the decision. I am willing to support the decision because I trust the wisdom of the group. Very often, this is the place where the round and around and around arguments continue. They're willing to move forward, but there's something they're feeling that they're not seeing. And in a sense, this is really saying, yes, I'm agreeing, I'm willing to move forward. And that's the kind of the interesting part about consensus. It's not everybody unanimous on the same page. But directionally, they're all thinking the same way and willing to move forward. There will be times where you have 5 or 6 where I am not in agreement with the decision and I'm going to stand away from this, stand in the way of this decision, or I see no sense of unity and we need to work before consensus can be reached. So these are clearly no's in this particular case, and it's good to kind of spend time figuring out why this person or these people feel the way they do, so they could move up to the other levels on the grid. So it's an interesting tool, very useful to have in team meetings. And then there's personality and preference types. So many of you have probably been through assessments such as Myers-Briggs, and this is one thing to know is that Myers-Briggs, while it's often referred to as a personality test, it's really a test, an assessment of preference, and there's 4 different categories. So, for example, category 1, there's the distinction between being an introvert or an extrovert. An introvert finds their energy from inside themselves. They get a new project and they want to sit down in their room and they want to study it and write stuff down and get their thoughts together, whereas the extrovert does the opposite, and they go out and they bounce ideas to other people. As it pertains to teams, this can work against, these people can work against each other, because the introvert would feel bothered, if you will, by the extrovert, because they're trying to think things through, and the extrovert's looking at the introvert and saying, well, why aren't they listening to me? I'm trying to get stuff accomplished, and back and forth. So there's a tension in these various styles. How people gather information, whether it be a top-down thinker, that's an N, or an intuitor, that needs a model or some formula or algorithm to process information, whereas the sensor S is more likely to think bottom up and can actually make decisions and react to things based on some stimulus that they're presented with. The sensor might look at the intuitor and say, why are you taking so long? Can't we move forward? And the intuitor might look at the sensor and say, don't you know what you're doing, and don't you think things through? And you can see how that can create a tension as well. How people make decisions, thinking versus feeling, whereas the thinker comes through the perspective of analysis and fact. The feeler comes from this perspective of impact on people, and you can see how that can create an interesting issue, and dynamic within a team, especially if these things are unstated and people are just kind of arguing their, from their preference point. And then the last one, structure, meaning, a judger is somebody who likes to finish things, likes closure on things, likes answers to things, whereas a perceiver is willing to keep things open and doesn't need to resolve things, and because more information might be available at some point down the road. Perceivers like questions, and you can see how that can create a tension as well within teams. So what's important here is to internalize this and say, where do you fit? There are 16 different preference types. So if there's all of these types in one team, that can create some very interesting dynamics. The way to kind of think about this again is that this is not a preference, not a personality, but a preference. Look at the opposite as sort of a blind spot. So, for example, an extrovert needs to know how to, think and come up with their own point of view on their own, whereas an introvert needs to learn how to express themselves and communicate in groups. You sort of need to be both. One of them is your preference, one of them is your blind spot, or an area of skill that you should be developing. An intuitor needs to learn how to, look at situations and respond to them and come up with strategies about that. A sensor should have a sense of what is the big picture and what is the strategic implications. A thinker should think about the impact on people, whereas a feeler should be comfortable with analytics and data. A judger, should understand that some people have more questions and need to keep things open to move forward. Whereas the perceiver needs to know that the judger, and you need to, so if you're a perceiver, you need to learn how to, manage projects and understand closure, right? So that's a good way to look at this. Is that, even though you might be one of these codes, you really, in practice, need to be both of them. I'm going to leave it like this for now, and we will cover more of these details as we get into the class.